Hey, everyone. Yeah, I know. It feels like we're all kind of glued to the news right now, trying to figure out what's going to happen with this whole Israel-Hamas thing.
It's definitely been a roller coaster.
Seriously, every day there's some new development that just leaves you wondering, what's next? So that's exactly why we're doing this deep dive today.
Right. Got to go deeper than just the headlines.
Exactly. We want to get into the why behind all this, especially these hostage deal talks, and try to figure out where things might be headed. We've got a whole stack of articles here, the Times of Israel, Jerusalem Post, some really insightful explainers, and even a piece from the New York Times.
It's interesting to see how the different outlets are framing this.
Oh, yeah, definitely. But the mission for us today is to not just know the latest news, but to really grasp the nuances of what's going on with these hostage talks.
It's a complicated situation, to say the least. And what's really hit me is just how many different factors are all coming together at the same time. It's putting immense pressure on both sides to try and reach some kind of deal.
Right. It's like a ticking time bomb, isn't it? I mean, we're talking Biden's legacy, Trump's return, and of course, most importantly, the lives of all those hostages.
And it's been months now.
I know, it's crazy. Months after those horrific attacks on October 7th, there are still almost 100 people being held captive in Gaza.
Yeah, it's heartbreaking. And this isn't just some humanitarian crisis either. It's become this major political flashpoint.
For sure. And for Biden, this is huge, right?
Huge. If he can pull off a successful deal in his last days in office, that'd be a massive foreign policy win.
I mean, talk about going out on a high note.
Right. But on the flip side, if this whole thing falls apart, it could be a major setback for him, potentially undermining everything he's tried to do to stabilize the region.
And then you've got Trump looming in the background, talking about all hell breaking loose if there's no deal by the time he takes office on January 20th.
It's not just talk either.
No, seriously. His envoy, Steve Witkoff, has already been busy meeting with Netanyahu and even the Prime Minister of Qatar.
Which, by the way, is really interesting because Qatar has been playing this crucial role in mediating the talks.
Yeah, they're kind of walking this diplomatic tightrope.
Exactly. They have this unique relationship with both Israel and Hamas, which makes them a crucial intermediary in this whole process.
So no pressure at all, right? But seriously, the pressure I S on, and it seems like Netanyahu is taking this very seriously.
He's definitely not messing around.
Nope. The Times of Israel reported that he sent this top-level team to Doha for the negotiations. We're talking the Mossad chief, the director of Shin Bet, which is Israel's internal security service. I mean, this is the A-team.
It really speaks volumes about the complexity of this whole thing. And you have to remember, the Shin Bet is super involved because their whole job is the safety of Israeli citizens. Plus, they gather intel on Hamas.
Right, so they have a unique perspective on the situation.
Exactly. So having them at the table, it just underlines how high the stakes are in this whole thing.
Okay, so we've got these intense deadlines, a highly sensitive negotiation process, and enough pressure to make anyone sweat. So help me understand this. What makes this specific deal so crucial? Not just for Israel, but for the whole region, and even for U.S.-Israel relations.
All right, well, first and foremost, it's about those hostages. Every single day they're held captive is another day of just agonizing uncertainty for them and their families. So getting a deal, securing their release is the top priority, and not just on humanitarian grounds, but for the Israeli government's credibility with its own people.
Right. If they can't even bring their own citizens home safe, it's going to be a huge blow to public confidence.
Exactly. It undermines their whole ability to protect their citizens. But beyond that, there are these wider implications for stability in the whole region.
Right, because the Middle East is already a tinderbox.
Absolutely. So a deal, especially one that includes a ceasefire, could really help calm things down. And that's something both the U.S. and Israel have a huge stake in.
Okay, I get that. But what about the flip side? What if a deal ends up being seen as too favorable to Hamas? Could that actually backfire and make things even more unstable? It feels like there's this really delicate balance here.
Oh, absolutely. And that's what makes these negotiations so tricky. It's not just about getting those hostages back. It's about finding a solution that actually addresses the underlying issues that are fueling the conflict in the first place. And that's where things get really, really complicated.
All right, so let's get into the nitty-gritty of these talks in Doha. What's actually on the table? What are they trying to hammer out?
So, going back to May, Biden actually proposed this three-phase deal. It started with the release of some hostages, coupled with easing some restrictions on Gaza.
Okay, so kind of a good faith first step.
Exactly. And the ultimate goal was to get a complete end to the war.
Sounds simple enough on paper, but...
Yeah, there's always a but, right? The devil's in the details, and one of the biggest sticking points, according to what we're seeing, is this whole issue of the ceasefire.
Right. Hamas wants that permanent ceasefire. No ifs, ands, or buts.
They're not budging on that. But Israel. Well, the New York Times used this interesting phrase. They said Israel wants ambiguity when it comes to any future military action.
So they basically want to keep the option open to strike again if they feel it's necessary.
Basically. And this difference in approach, it really gets to the core of the whole conflict.
Yeah, because for Hamas, a permanent ceasefire, that would be a huge E-win.
It would. They'd see it as international recognition of their legitimacy, a guarantee of their security, which, given their history with blockades and military operations, they see as absolutely essential.
But from Israel's point of view, agreeing to something like that, it'd be like giving up one of their biggest bargaining chips.
It would. They argue that having the possibility of military action is crucial to prevent future attacks and keep their citizens safe. It's a really tough position for both sides.
It highlights just how much mistrust there is between them.
Oh, absolutely. Both sides view every single action the other one takes through this lens of their own history, their own experiences. It makes finding any common ground incredibly difficult.
Okay, so for a second, imagine you're in that room in Doha. You're one of these negotiators. What are you thinking about? What kind of trade-offs are you weighing? What would you be willing to give up to get those hostages back?
The tough question.
Right. Is a perfect deal one where everyone walks away happy, even possible in this kind of situation?
That's the million-dollar question. The problem is, every concession comes with a potential cost. Like, releasing Palestinian prisoners might be necessary to get the hostages freed.
Sure, that seems like a logical trade.
But it could also embolden Hamas, make future attacks more likely.
It's like a ripple effect, right?
Yeah. You can never predict how things will play out.
Mm.
And then there's the issue of Gaza itself. Lifting the restrictions would definitely ease the humanitarian crisis there.
Which is desperately needed.
No question. But it could also strengthen Hamas's hold on the region, give them the chance to consolidate their power, build up their military even more.
So every decision has these massive potential consequences.
Absolutely. It's like walking a tightrope. With the weight of those hostages' lives on one side, the pressure from everyone watching on the other, and the very real threat of things exploding if the talks collapse right beneath you.
It's kind of mind-blowing to think about, but you know what's interesting? In the middle of all this tension, all this uncertainty, something totally unexpected happened.
Oh yeah, that caught everyone off guard.
Right. Multiple sources are reporting that Hamas is actually being more flexible than anyone expected. It seems like even the Israeli negotiators were surprised.
The Jerusalem Post even used the phrase caught off guard to describe their reaction.
It's crazy. Like, they provided a list of the living hostages, which they'd always refused to do before.
Yeah, that was a big deal.
And they even added names to the list at Israel's request. And get this. They're not even objecting to Israel keeping a presence in certain areas, like the Philadelphia corridor.
And that's really significant because the Philadelphia corridor, it's this narrow strip of land right on the border between Gaza and Egypt. And it's strategically vital for Israel.
Because it gives them control over what goes in and out of Gaza.
Exactly. It helps prevent smuggling, stops potential weapons from getting into Gaza. So for Hamas to say, yeah, okay, you can stay there, that's a major concession. It makes you wonder why the sudden change of heart.
Right. What's driving this newfound flexibility? What's their angle?
Well, there are a few possibilities. One is maybe they're feeling the pressure more than they're letting on.
The blockade has to be taking its toll.
Oh, absolutely. The situation in Gaza is dire. So there might be internal pressure even from within Hamas itself to just get any deal done, no matter the cost.
So they might be realizing that something is better than nothing.
Yeah, especially with things being so bad in Gaza. But another possibility is this is a calculated gamble on their part. Maybe they're betting that they can get a better deal from Biden in these last days he's in office than they could ever get from Trump.
Because Trump's likely to be much tougher.
Right. It's like this high-stakes poker game. Each side's trying to read the other one, figure out their next move.
And that brings up another big question, doesn't it?
It does.
If Hamas is genuinely willing to compromise, what's the price tag they're looking for? What do they want in return for being flexible?
That's what everyone's trying to figure out. And it leads us to the other side of this negotiating table, where Netanyahu's facing his own set of pressures.
He's got more than just Hamas to worry about.
Exactly. He's got to deal with his own coalition partners, and they're watching his every move, especially those on the far right.
Yeah, they're not exactly known for being willing to compromise.
Not at all. And these partners particularly those from parties like Religious Zionism and Otzma Yehudit. They're absolutely against making any concessions to Hamas, period.
So anything that doesn't look like a total victory for Israel.
They see it as weakness. And that puts Netanyahu in a really tough spot.
He's got to walk this crazy tightrope.
I know, right? He needs those partners' votes to stay in power.
But if he gives in to their demands too much, the whole negotiation with Hamas could blow up.
Precisely. And we've actually seen these tensions spill out into the open. Finance Minister Smotrich and National Security Minister Ben-Gvir, both from those far-right parties, they've publicly threatened to quit the government if Netanyahu makes a deal they don't like.
So they're basically holding his government hostage.
In a way, yeah. They're putting huge pressure on him to make sure any deal reflects their hardline stance.
Wow, so Netanyahu is literally caught between a rock and a hard place. Hamas pushing for concessions on one side and his own coalition threatening to collapse his government on the other.
It's like a political thriller playing out in real life.
And it shows just how complex Israeli politics really are.
It does.
Yeah.
You've got these deep ideological divisions, personal rivalries, a really fragile coalition government, all feeding into this super high-stakes situation. It's like a game of chess where every move could trigger a whole cascade of unintended consequences.
And to add another layer of intrigue to all this, the Times of Israel reported this crazy little detail. Orit Strock, who's a big name in the Religious Zionism party, she came out and publicly slammed a potential deal.
Yeah, I remember that.
But then, get this, she admitted she didn't even know the details of the deal.
Oh, that's classic political theater. It just goes to show how much posturing and maneuvering is going on behind the scenes.
It's wild. So for our listeners, what does all this tell us about the state of these talks? What's the takeaway from all this political drama?
Well, for me, it really drives home the point that this isn't just about hostages. It's about this power struggle within Israel itself, about different visions for what Israel's future should look like.
And the outcome of this deal, if there even is one, it could have huge implications for Netanyahu's political future.
Oh, yeah, for sure. It could strengthen his position or it could weaken it. We'll have to see how it plays out.
It's like a fascinating and kind of terrifying glimpse into the inner workings of a country grappling with all these complex challenges.
Both internal and external.
Exactly. And it highlights that these negotiations are about so much more than just getting signatures on a piece of paper.
Right. It's about trying to navigate these deep divisions, balance competing interests, and hopefully find a way forward that offers some kind of hope for a more peaceful future.
And that's what makes this whole situation so captivating and, to be honest, a little bit terrifying. The stakes are just incredibly high. Not just for the hostages and their families, but for the entire region.
No question. It really underlines that this isn't about just getting a signature on a piece of paper. It has to be a deal that holds, one that actually makes more conflict less likely. Otherwise, what's the point?
Right. It'd be like putting a Band-Aid on a huge wound, but not dealing with the infection underneath.
Exactly. So even if a deal happens, even if those hostages are freed, it's not like things just magically go back to normal.
No, of course not. There's so much damage that's been done.
Exactly. The issues that caused this whole thing in the first place, they don't just disappear. Gaza's future, Hamas's goals, the fact that these two sides basically don't trust each other at all.
Right. That's not going away overnight.
No. So the best case scenario, this deal is a tiny step towards maybe starting to address those issues. It's not the solution in itself.
Okay, so as we're recording this, things are changing so fast, and that clock is ticking loudly coast. Big question. Deal or no deal by January 20th? What happens if that deadline comes and goes and they haven't figured it out?
That's when things could get really, really unpredictable. Because you've got Trump coming in, and he seems ready to take a much tougher stance. He's already made those warnings about all hell breaking loose. And his incoming VP, J.D. Vance, has been even more specific about what that might actually look like.
Right. Vance actually laid out some scenarios.
And they're not pretty.
Not at all. He talked about enabling the Israelis to go after the remaining Hamas battalions, which, according to the IDF, they haven't done yet because they think those battalions are where a lot of the hostages are being held.
And the IDF has been incredibly careful to avoid any large-scale operations in areas where they think hostages are being held. Exactly, to minimize the risk to those hostages, both accidentally, like getting caught in the crossfire, or intentionally, if Hamas feels trapped and decides to harm the hostages.
So Vance's comment, they're basically suggesting a totally different approach, right?
They are, one that doesn't prioritize the safety of the hostages as much. and that could make things a lot more dangerous.
So, to put it bluntly, under a Trump administration, those hostages might not be the top priority anymore.
It's definitely a possibility, and it raises some really serious questions. Vance also talked about tougher sanctions, financial penalties, not just against Hamas, but against anyone who supports them. And that could have ripple effects way beyond just Hamas.
It could impact other countries in the region.
And potentially destabilize an already unstable situation even more.
So yeah, the closer we get to January 20th, the higher the stakes get. But amidst all this talk about ultimatums and the possibility of military action, there's something that feels missing to me.
I know what you mean. It's easy to get caught up in the big picture.
Exactly. All the sources we've been looking at, they focus on these big players. Biden, Trump, Netanyahu, the Hamas leadership. But what about the actual hostages? What about their families who've been going through this agonizing wait for months?
It's easy to lose sight of the human side of things when you're talking about geopolitics and all these potential consequences.
But we can't forget that there are real people at the center of all this.
People who've been through something absolutely horrific. People who are just clinging to hope.
And their lives have been completely turned upside down. Imagine the fear, the desperation, not knowing what's happening to your loved one day after day.
Their voices, their stories, they're just as important as all the stuff we hear from politicians and experts.
Absolutely. Their lives are literally hanging in the balance.
It's a powerful reminder that these aren't just pieces on a chessboard. These are human beings with families, with hopes and dreams, and no matter what happens with these negotiations, they're going to be dealing with the effects of this for a long, long time. And that's something I think we all need to remember as we follow this story. Amidst all the talk of deadlines and ultimatums and consequences, we have to remember the human cost of this conflict. It's easy to get swept up in the geopolitical drama, but the most important thing is the people whose lives are being affected.
It's a good reminder that peace isn't just about stopping a war. It's about fixing the things that caused the war in the first place. It's about making sure everyone feels safe and secure.
Exactly. And that's a huge task in a place like Gaza, where you have so many people living in such a small area, dealing with poverty, limited resources, and this long history of violence.
We've talked a lot about the impact this will have on Israel, on the region as a whole, but what about the U.S.-Israel relationship, especially with how differently Biden and Trump seem to be approaching this?
That's a huge part of this that we can't ignore. If Biden can pull off a successful deal, it would be a big diplomatic win for him. It could actually strengthen the ties between the U.S. and Israel.
Because it would show that he's committed to the region.
Right. And that he can handle these super complex negotiations. But if it falls apart, or even if a deal happens but then quickly unravels, it could damage that relationship, especially with Trump and Vance waiting in the wings, ready to jump in and criticize anything that's been done.
And with Trump's more hardline stance, there's a worry that if he gets back in office, things could escalate instead of calm down.
Oh, absolutely. He's already said he's willing to use force, and his rhetoric could embolden those on both sides who prefer a military solution over diplomacy.
Which brings us back to this question that's been hanging over this whole conversation. Is a lasting peace deal even possible? Can these two sides, with all their history and mistrust, actually find a way to coexist peacefully?
That's the big question, isn't it?
Yeah.
And no one really knows the answer. There's so many things at play here. The politics within both Israel and Hamas, the influence of other countries in the region, the role of the international community.
And probably most importantly, whether these two sides are actually willing to compromise, to give a little, to get a little.
Right. It's easy to get pessimistic. You look at the history of failed negotiations, the ongoing violence, and it feels like peace is just this impossible dream.
It can feel that way, for sure.
But there are reasons to be cautiously optimistic. There are people on both sides who genuinely want peace, who are tired of all the fighting and suffering.
Right. Most people just want to live their lives in peace.
Exactly. And there have been conflicts that seemed impossible to solve that eventually did find some kind of resolution. Maybe not perfect, but better than the alternative.
So what's the key? How do you break through all that mistrust and violence?
That's the challenge, isn't it? It's about finding a way to create a space for dialogue, for understanding, and to address the root causes of the conflict, the things that each side feels are fundamentally unfair.
It's a long and tough process, but the alternative, just letting the conflict continue.
That's not acceptable. It leads to more suffering, more loss. And I think this whole situation reminds us that peace isn't something that just happens on its own. It takes work, it takes commitment, And it takes a willingness to see the humanity in those we see as our enemies.
It's a good reminder that peace isn't just about stopping a war. It's about fixing the things that caused the war in the first place. It's about making sure everyone feels safe and secure.
Exactly. And that's a monumental task in a place like Gaza, where you have this densely populated area facing economic hardship, limited resources, and a history of violence.
We've talked a lot about the potential consequences for Israel and the region, but what about the impact on U.S.-Israel relations, especially given the stark differences between Biden and Trump's approach to this whole situation?
That's a crucial aspect that we can't overlook. A successful deal brokered by the Biden administration would be a diplomatic victory, potentially strengthening ties between the U.S. and Israel.
It would demonstrate Biden's commitment to the region and his ability to navigate these complex negotiations.
But if the deal falls apart, or if a deal is reached but then quickly unravels, it could strain those ties, especially with Trump and Vance waiting in the wings, ready to criticize and potentially undermine any progress made.
And with Trump's more hardline stance, there's a real concern that his return to office could escalate tensions rather than ease them.
Absolutely. He's already signaled a willingness to use more forceful measures, and his rhetoric could embolden those on both sides who favor a military solution over diplomacy.
Which brings us to a question that's been looming over this entire discussion. Is a lasting peace deal even possible? Can these two sides, with such a long history of conflict and mistrust, find a way to coexist peacefully?
That's the ultimate question, isn't it? And it's one that no one can answer with certainty. There are so many factors at play. The political dynamics within both Israel and Hamas, the influence of regional powers, the role of the international community, and perhaps most importantly, the willingness of both sides to make difficult compromises.
It's easy to get caught up in the pessimism, to look at the history of failed negotiations and the ongoing violence and feel like peace is an impossible dream.
But there are also reasons for cautious optimism. There are people on both sides who genuinely want peace, who are tired of the bloodshed and the suffering.
And there are precedents for seemingly intractable conflicts eventually finding a resolution, however imperfect.
The key, it seems, lies in finding a way to break through the cycle of mistrust and violence, to create a space for dialogue and understanding, and to address the underlying grievances that fuel this conflict.
It's a long and difficult process, but ultimately, the alternative, continued conflict and suffering, is simply unacceptable.
It's a reminder that peace isn't something that just happens. It requires effort, commitment, and a willingness to see the humanity in those we perceive as our enemies.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the complexities of the hostage deal talks, what's the one thing you hope our listeners take away from this conversation?
I think the most important takeaway is this. While the situation is incredibly complex and the outcome uncertain, there's always hope for a more peaceful future. But achieving that future requires understanding the nuances of the conflict, acknowledging the legitimate concerns of both sides, and most importantly, never losing sight of the human cost of this ongoing struggle.
Beautifully put. And as the situation continues to unfold, remember to look beyond the headlines, consider the multiple perspectives at play, and never lose sight of the human element at the heart of it all. Because ultimately, this isn't just about politics or strategy, it's about people's lives, their hopes, their dreams, and their right to live in peace and security.